Welcome to It's About Time. We are studying the Word chronologically, and this is Exodus chapters 36 through 38. We are continuing as we heard in chapters 35. We were talking about Bezalel and Oliab, who were called and directed as they were skillful artisans to carry out the direction of God in building the temple. And they also helped everyone know their gifts. And in verse 1, the sanctuary needed to be built as God had commanded. Verse 2, there was a passion for the work to be done. Have you heard the saying, there was a tugging of the heart? This is something that every believer should have as a passion for them. And as just as we have in our jobs, we have this as doing the work for the kingdom. And this is where the people were. We must have that stirring and tugging of the heart to get the work of the Lord done. An interesting thought here is that the Lord had put skill into everyone. So 21st century, are we ready to do the work that the Lord has put in us? The people brought offerings to help build the tabernacle, and they were still bringing them in verse 3. And so in verse 4 they were working. Verse 5, the people the people who were working told Moses about the ones who were bringing in the offerings, is that the tabernacle was going to be completed and there was more than enough to complete it. So not to bring in any more materials. So, wait, can you picture the people having more than enough to accomplish what the Lord had commanded them? Because of the tugging of the heart, because they wanted to see, they wanted to be obedient to God. Because remember, they had also agreed to the covenant to be obedient to God. So, verse 6, Moses had to put out a decree to all the people to not perform to not perform work any longer, because the contributions of the sanctuary had been met. So the people were restrained from bringing any more. Now we can appreciate how Moses can respect the people's time and not just have them work just because. I can appreciate that with Moses being the kind of pastor he was, that there was no trying to take advantage of anyone or anyone doing more than what was required, but not based um, on what they were actually able to do. That's what it was based on. Verse 7, the material they had was sufficient and more than enough for all the work to be performed. Now, this is the price of the work being blessed. The work was blessed. And this reminds me when Jesus fed the 5,000 and there were 12 baskets left. Now, verse 8, all the skillful people among them who were performing the work made the tabernacle with 10 curtains of fine twisted linen and violet, purple, and scarlet material with cherubim. The work of the skilled embroiderer Bezalel, that was the one that made them. He was skillful with his hands. And if you are making a cherubim, you had to be skillful, and all hands were on deck as everyone used their skill to get the work done. The beautiful blue, purple, and scarlet used to put in the tabernacle. And I personally love seeing fabric made by hand. All the specialists, all the people who were called to do the work, they were working. You don't hear about any fussing, any fighting, but everyone was working to get the tabernacle built. So 21st century, we are specialists as well in the area that God has called us to do, and it's important that we use our specialties and our gifts to build the kingdom. Now the curtains used um, were 28 cubits long, 4 cubits wide. I'm sorry, yes. And then verse 10, there were 5 curtains connected to another 5, and on the edge of them were loops of violet. Now the details for verse 12 is 50 loops in both curtains, and the loops were opposite of one another. So if we can visualize, um, when we're discussing these chapters, we're dealing with rectangle shapes. So some shapes, some sides will be even, and you're hearing the 20 and the 12, 6 and 6, the 50, 25, 25. And just think about how those visualize, rather, since there's no picture, visualize how that is actually set up. And then in verse 13, Bezalel made 50 gold clasps to be put on the curtains. And these I visualize are like our curtain hooks, but they were of gold. And in these chapters, you're going to hear pure gold. Now, 11 curtains were made in verse 14, and that the curtains were made from goat's hair for the tent, to go over the tabernacle. The length of each curtain was 45 feet, and the width was 6 feet. Again, there were 50 loops that were made to go actually on the edge of the curtain. Now, in verse 17, in both the first and set of curtains, remember how there's five, but they were put together and those had the 50 loops on the edge of the curtains. Now, verse 18, we were just talking about 50 loops, but here we're talking about, and it's just amazing, these details. The 50 clasp of bronze was made to join the tent together so that it would be a unit. Again, we appreciate the details because we are, as a reminder that our God is a detailed God. And even with the things we do, we don't just halfway do them. We make sure that they are done in excellence. And this work that was being done, the measurements were not going to be in vain, because this was a place again that God's presence was going to live, and they were going to carry it around. My God, that's so powerful. The tent covering in verse 19 is made from ram skin and is dyed with red and covered by fine leather. The excellence of this. Acacia wood from verse 20 is used for boarding the tabernacle, which stood up to be, the boards were actually 15 feet. 20 of the boards, as in verse 23, I'm sorry, yes, 20 were made, and 40 bases of silver from verse 24 were also made. So each board had two bases that fit together for the south side. The other side of the tabernacle, as in verse 25, had 20 boards, which were for the north side. The 40 bases were under another board. I know it seems a lot, but these details are very important. And then the back of the tabernacle in verse 27 on the west had 6 boards, and there were 2 boards for the corners of the tabernacle from verse 6. Now, I highly recommend, which I have done, Googling images of the tabernacle from Exodus, because it's really interesting to see the layout, the different layouts, but to see, when I talked about there being the rectangle space, the creation, the visual is really important, how it matters in creating plans, as it matters in creating teams to work. And this was, again, a place for the Lord's people to come before him and his presence. Now, verse 30, the 8 boards with their 16 silver bases, though the boards were going to go under every board. And verse 31, acacia wood is used again for the boards for the sides of the tabernacle. Now, acacia is a very durable wood and it can stand the test of time. So, as you follow us in the word and you hear about the Israelites being in different cities, different sections, you're going to understand how different weather environments, of how important it was to use materials that will last throughout the time, and then coming into the time where Jesus is, where though that tabernacle was no longer needed, because he then dwells in us today. Gold was put over the boards in verse 34, and Bezalel made the veil of violet, mixture of purple and scarlet. And then verse 35, he made fine twisting lines inside of the veil. Now, this man was so skillful, and I mentioned the cherubims he made earlier, but it's going to be more details. Now, think about this design for a minute, because the cherubims are heavenly beings. So, they're used where the wings are covering their face, and these are the ones that are going back and forth to God. Now, shittim wood, Shittim, was like acacia wood that was used for the four pillars, and gold was put over them, and they had hooks with four sockets of silver. Verse 37, the tabernacle door colors were blue, purple, and fine linen. Gold was on the beams that held the pillars, and in verse 38, the five sockets were filled with brass. So lots of detail. And then here we are in verse 37. We are continuing with the temple. Bezalel, the artesian specialist and designer, made the ark from acacia wood, 1.5 foot wide, and the height is 1 cubit. Gold was laid over the ark in verse 2, and it also had pure gold on the inside and out, and the moldings were gold. Wow, wow, wow. And what specialty has been used here in details? Verse 4 and 5 describes the poles used to carry the tabernacle, and the poles were also acacia, and the rings to go on each side had gold over them. Pure gold was put over the atoning cover in verse 6, and there were two cherubim of gold in verse 7, and these were at each end, and those were part of the atoning cover, and that was detailed work. One cherubim was on, I mentioned, on each end in verse 8. Now the cherubim had their wings spread upward in verse 9 that covered the atoning cover. And this is so powerful. The table for the ark in verse 10 was made of acacia wood and was 3 feet wide and 1 foot high. Gold is over the wood and the molding in verse 11. Bezalel handmade a rim, and the moldings were gold. Verse 13, four gold rings were put on the covers. The poles were made, as I mentioned, from acacia. They had gold on them. The utensils used for the table in verse 16 were made from pure gold. The lamp stand was made of pure gold and showed a hammered look, and it was a hammered work, very, very hard work in verse 17, in which the flowers and bulbs had one piece in them. And we can visualize seeing thinking about churches I visited in Dominican Republic, where you see the flowers and bulbs, where it's like almost like a J shape, where it's surrounding the four corners of the temple. Well, in this case, the tabernacle. The lampstand in verse 20 had four cups shaped like almond blossoms. Pure gold in verse 22 was on the bulb branches, part of the cherubims. Verse 23, Bezalel made 7 lamps, the tongues and trays. All of those were made in pure gold. Now, what even the thinking about the talent that he had, again, he's in charge, he's doing these things by hand, and he's not alone in this. Now we can admit that, and we can admit our own, if we can just admit our own talents, our pure talent that God has given us. Verse 25, he made the altar of incense of acacia wood, and the horns were one piece in it. Now the horns had gold molding on it from verse 27, and the gold rings that went under the moldings on its two sides in verse 27. Bezalel made holy oil and the pure fragrant incense of spices. He also utilized his work as a perfumer. That's what it says. He does not cease to amaze us, and he created pure perfume. So here we have our last chapter in 38. Bezalel made the altar of burnt offering from acacia wood, which was 7 feet long, 7 feet wide, and 5 feet high. The horns from verse 2 were made of bronze that are over the horns on the corners. And then in verse 3, the utensils, shovels, Basins, meat forks, and fire pans were made of bronze. A grating of bronze netting beneath it, which Bezalel made, that was done in verse 4. The gratings in verse 5 had four rings on them. The poles in verse 6, remember, again, we're talking about the poles that are part of the burnt offering, the altar for the burnt offerings, were made from acacia wood, and bronze was laid over them. So you can hear how the gold, how the silver, and how the bronze is being used in the things of the Lord. And then again with the basin and the base were made of the bronze. And the interesting thing, I'm sorry, not the basins were the basins were made from mirrors by women who served at the doorway of the tent of meeting. And this is very important, as you know, women who are watching this video can see the importance of you helping in the work of the ministry. So that is very important to um, take a look at. Okay. And we have the outer courtyard on the south that was 150 feet in verse 9 of fine twisted linen. Verse 10, the 20 pillars and 20 bases were made of bronze. So again, how we're utilizing all of um, the material that we have. And of course, the gold, silver, and bronze. The north side length was also 150 feet. The west and east side was 75 feet. Well, again, with the north side, the south side length was the same amount. The hangings that draped for verse 22 were 22 and a half feet. There is fine linen that is surrounding the hangings. Now the hooks and the pillars are of silver. The curtain of the gate of the courtyard in verse 18 was the work of the weaver of violet, purple, and scarlet material and fine twisted linen that was 30 feet. The four pillars in verse 19 and their bases were of bronze, their hooks were of silver, and the overlaying of their tops and their hooks were of silver. Now, details are very important, which we see here. Bronze covered the pegs of the tabernacle, and the next scriptures we're looking into, we're studying, is a breakdown of what was included in the tabernacle. And we have in verse 24, there was a 1,900 pounds of gold used, 603,550 men from verse 26 were used, and 3¼ ton of silver was used. Verse 29, the bronze ewed weighed 4,522 pounds, and that was used for the tent of the meeting door, the utensils, bases for the courtyard, and pegs for the dwelling and the courtyard. 21st century, we have specialty crafted brothers and sisters who can help us in accomplishing the work that has been set, that the Lord has commanded us to do. So thank you for being about time. It is about time for us to grow together in the Word. God bless you.